presentation sessions. Again, as a reminder, these were scheduled in to provide opportunity for key organizations, key folks who've been involved in this issue, who had an interest in presenting information directly to the executive work group as it related in particular to the different bodies of work we're doing as we go along. Best available science, the hybrid options, etc. We're having some presentations on historical considerations. This is not an alternative to the whole public input process that we've put in place. So we're encouraging people as your first touch and second touch documents come through to be actually involved in this, but this presents an added opportunity for a face-to-face presentation and some time for Q&A for the executive work group with some key folks who indicated they were interested, and we have identified a certain amount of time for each presenter. So since we've not done this before, the dance we have in mind is there is 20 minutes, and since we're starting 5 minutes late, I'll give you your full time period of 25 minutes, plus a 5-minute Q&A afterwards with our first presenter, and then we have a discussion. I've asked each of the presenters to indicate whether they would prefer questions at the end of their presentation or take as they go along. The ones I talked to, like Barb indicated, they prefer to take them at the end, but I'll let Ken speak to that. And so our first presenter is Dr. Milne from Evergreen State College, PhD on Capitol Lake and Puget Sound, and analysis of the use and misuse of the Bud Inlet model.
Okay. Thank you, Paul, and board members. Thank you for having me here, and it's a pleasure to address you. I'm Dave Milne, retired Evergreen faculty member. I was asked by CLIPA to review some of the Department of Ecology's modeling results, and I did that, wrote a review of it, and I'm here to present the findings of that review today. Now, everyone has a copy of my review, and I explain what I did and how I got the answers in great detail. You can follow every step in that, that review. So that's one reason why I think we can put off most questions till the end. And I will explain what I found without saying much about how I found it. So here we are. Next slide, please. And here is the top line. Great Capital, Great Waters. Deschutes River, Capitol Lake, Bud Inlet, they're all connected. And down the side here, Capitol Lake is one of the healthiest lakes in our county. The lake takes tons of nutrients out of the Deschutes River every summer. The lake protects Puget Sound from oxygen depletion. The lake supports a healthy aquatic ecosystem. The lake is clean enough for swimming, sailing, and kids fishing. And our topic today, the Bud Inlet model misrepresents many of these positive features. Next one, please. First of all, about the Bud Inlet model, this is a computer simulation that simulates Bud Inlet. I don't know if you can see it in this dark slide here, but here's what the computer thinks it looks like. It divides up the inlet into 160 different grid cells. Each one is divided into about 15 depths, and it works wonders of calculation. And what it's looking for in the context that we're interested in today is dissolved oxygen levels. The stars and bars in this figure over here are at locations where we actually know what those values are from a huge survey that was done in 1997, I believe, it was called the Bud Inlet Scientific Study. So that's where the observed data comes from that I will be citing today. Those are the only sites where observed data can be compared with the computer's calculated values. Next one, please. Here's how the model shows calculated predictions of water quality violations. It creates these paint by number maps. This is the grid of Bud Inlet, and the painted squares are the ones in which the computer shows that there are water quality dissolved oxygen violations. The clear squares are ones that have been searched, but the computer found no violations. The blue color is the smallest of all violations, 0.2 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. All of these violations are theoretical predictions calculated by the model. They are not observed real values. And this particular figure shows what kinds of violations are caused, according to the computer, in Bud Inlet by the dam. Next one, please. Here's a history of reports and resources that I've had access to. Starting here, 2012, DOE's tech report, TMDL report, a poster that they came out with in 2014. My response, also in 2014, the lake helps the inlet. Then I wrote another one of Capitol Lake called The Healthiest Lake in Thurston County. The Department of Ecology came out with the document that I am reviewing today, the Supplemental Modeling Report, and my response is, my review is misuse of the model report. Yeah, that's the one that you all have copies of. And let's see, oh, the data sources, this is very important. Data sources are from the Bud Inlet Scientific Study that was published in 1998, and that is one of the best studies ever made of Bud Inlet. And some of that data has been used in the TMDL appendix, and I think there's some original data from other sources in there as well, and I've used that as well. Okay, next one, please. Here's today's topics. 1, where the computer's calculations can be compared with real-life water quality data, the model gets wrong answers in most cases, something more than 50%. This red one here, the water quality standards used are often based on an artificial concept calculated by the error-prone model, and the concept is the natural lake or estuary that no one can verify. Third, model calculations showing the lake degrading Bud Inlet have many serious discrepancies and shortcomings that need to be explained before they can be taken at face value. The model can't simulate the whole growing season ecology of Capitol Lake, but is used as though it can. Department of Ecology's mistaken claims of oxygen depletion in the lake are based on calculation errors, the contrived natural lake water quality standard, and a fundamental misunderstanding of a key feature of lake ecology. The ones that are in red are much, much too complicated to explain in 25 minutes, so we'll kind of skim over those, but you can find my detailed analysis in each of these cases in the report that's in front of you. Okay, next one, please. First, the Bud Inlet model gets wrong answers. Okay, next please, Paul, next one, thank you. Here's an example of the computer's calculations. This wiggly graph going along here, it starts at January 25th, 1997 and ends September 15th, 1997. That's the period of time that the model simulates. And so those are dates. On this axis we have concentration of oxygen with 0 here and very high levels, 18 parts per million up here. So the circles are places where we actually know what the right answer was from observations in the Bud Inlet Scientific Study. So you can assess, how many times out of all these numbers of correct known observations does the computer get the right answer? And in this case, it's about 50%. That's where the graph passes through the point, but in other points, the observed values are missed. This is for the surface water out near Boston Harbor. Okay, next one, please. Now this shows the same thing except for all locations and all of the graphs for which, like the last one. Here is locations on Bud Inlet from West Bay, East Bay, Priest Point, up the inlet and out to Boston Harbor. The one that we were just looking at is this blue bar here. This is the percent of calculations that are accurate, that actually hit the mark, predict exactly what was observed. Blue bars are for the surface, red bars are for midwater, black bars are for the bottom. And for the inlet as a whole, the accuracy rate is about 50%. It ranges from 20% in some cases to 80% in other cases. But basically, it doesn't get the right answer in all of its calculations. Okay, next one, please. Now, the water quality standard used by the model is often theoretical, that means fictitious, and almost always unverifiable. Here's what the standards really are. In the middle of the inlet, it's 6 milligrams per liter. If you're out there measuring DO and it is below that, then that's a real water quality violation. In the south end of the inlet, the standard is 5, and it's the same thing. If you measure DOs and they're less than 5, that is a real violation. This shows in the supplemental modeling report the only figure that shows us how the natural inlet before human activity began to modify it would look. And it's presented in a format where you simply can't tell whether there's violations or not from that. Okay, see my review for a detailed discussion of the problems caused by this report and these figures. The figure on the front cover of my report shows, well, it shows what this one should have looked like and how it compares with Bud Inlet. Okay, next one, please. 3 and 4, the uptake of nutrient nitrogen from the Deschutes River by the lake's plants helps Bud Inlet resist low oxygen conditions. Ecology's calculation to the contrary is flawed and not ecologically credible. And 4, the model is not suitable for evaluating the effects of the lake's plants on Bud Inlet. Next one, please. Here's something everybody needs to know. Why are we so concerned about nutrient nitrogen? Well, it's because it can lead to depleted oxygen. So here we have a little scenario. People are adding fertilizer to their lawns. Yay, the lawn looks green. The fertilizer gets into the lake and phytoplankton cells soak it up, grow, and generate a tremendous amount of new oxygen right at the surface. Now, most of that oxygen at the surface fizzes back into the atmosphere. It doesn't really help the lake much. The phytoplankton cells sink to the bottom, and on the bottom, bacteria decay them, and they can actually use up all of the oxygen in the bottom water. Now, this happens to all of the monitored lakes in Thurston County every summer. Summit Lake, Black Lake, Long Lake, Ward Lake, Hicks Lake, Lake St. Clair, all of them experience this zero oxygen condition during the summer, except Capitol Lake. Capitol Lake is the only one that does not. And Capitol Lake does not even get low in dissolved oxygen. As we'll see, it remains high. Okay, next one, please. Now this shows Capitol Lake's plants trapping nitrogen. And this was done by the CH2M Hill firm in 1977. This axis runs from January to December of that year, and this axis tells you how much nutrient nitrogen there was in the water. And the blue bar is the amount of nitrogen in the Deschutes River where it enters the lake. The red bar is the amount of nitrogen in the water just before it goes over the dam. So you can see the amount going out is about the same as the amount going in, some difference in detail, until we get into April. Then the lake's plants kick in, they start absorbing nitrogen, and they keep on absorbing it right till the end of October. Then the plant growth stops and the amount going out is about the same as the amount coming in. So there is your fantastic natural water treatment plant in action, Capitol Lake. And keeping that nutrient nitrogen out of Bud Inlet is a very, very good thing. We could actually maybe make it even better by harvesting and removing some of the plants. This is a way of helping the lake help Puget Sound. Okay, next one, please. Now, Department of Ecology says, well, the lake's removal of nutrient nitrogen doesn't really help Bud Inlet. And the reason they say that is they say, well, the plants take it up, yes, but then they immediately break off, or their phytoplankton, they go over the dam into Bud Inlet, they immediately decay and just release all that nitrogen in Bud Inlet. That's their claim. This is much too complex to analyze here, but a detailed analysis is in my review. This graph shows the blue line is what the amount of nitrogen that would be going into the inlet if we had an estuary. The green line shows the amount of nitrogen going in if we had a lake, and sure enough, their model shows that it's 0 at times. It's a good model for showing the general state of things. And up here, same kind of graph, except here they're talking about total organic carbon. And the one that puts the most total organic carbon in Budd Inlet is the one that is having the worst impact on Budd Inlet. And as you can see, their graph shows that that's the lake. These graphs are in error. That's all I'll say about it. And in fact, it's the other way around. The lake puts less total organic carbon into Budd Inlet than the estuary, even using their own figures, which are obtainable from this graph right here. Okay, enough of that one, that's complex. But anyway, this is the centerpiece of their claim that the lake damages Budd Inlet. And I think they've got it backwards, but of course I could have it backwards, so somebody needs to check it. Next one, please. This is the graph that we saw before of nitrogen going in and going out of the lake. And this is Department of Ecology's nitrogen graph going along here. It's superimposed from the previous slide. The model stops right here on September 15th. The uptake process continues through October and finally ends about November. So the model by itself is not capable of evaluating this hypothesis, and the only thing that can do it is to have a field study of it. Okay, next please. What am I doing? Department of Ecology's analysis of Capitol Lake. There are errors at many levels. Next please. This figure is offered by Department of Ecology to show that Capitol Lake is very, very defective in its oxygen levels, that in fact it has as many as 4 milligrams per liter less oxygen in the water as it would if it were a natural lake unaffected by human activities. Now that figure has been propagated for 4 years now, and there's several things that are wrong with it. This is the calculated, computer simulated Capitol Lake compared with the calculated, computer simulated natural lake. Over here is the real situation. These are observed oxygen levels in Capitol Lake summer 2014. These data were taken by the Thurston County Water Resources Department. And here's 6 dates in 2014 in the summer from May to October when they did measurements. And on this axis is the amount of oxygen they found in the Capitol Lake water on those occasions. So Capitol Lake has DOs on the order of 12, which is just unbelievably high for water. And at the surface, it's not much less than that the entire summer. The bottom curve is shown there. And at worst, it gets down to about 9 milligrams per liter. The red line is the standard for the lower Deschutes River. That's 8 milligrams per liter. So the lake is better than the river standard. And this purple zone, anything above 7 is regarded as extraordinary dissolved oxygen. Below that, if it gets worse than that, then it's excellent. If it gets worse than that, then it's good. If it gets worse than that, then it's fair. At about 4 milligrams per liter, you start worrying about negative impacts on fish and aquatic life. So the lake is like this all summer long, not just 2014, every year. And there is no such thing as oxygen depletion in Capitol Lake ever. Next one, please. Now it's possible to check up. This is one of those rare cases where you can check up on what's going on in the natural scenario. Okay, and the reason you can do it is you know the percent saturation of oxygen in the water right in the south end of the lake. The Tumwater Falls gives, it saturates the water with oxygen at 100%. And if you know that, you can then check up on Department of Ecology's calculations. You almost never know that, but in this case you do. Next one, please. And when you check up on them, you find that they've made a mistake, and you can see in my review how I checked up on them, and I would like for you to check up on me to see if I've made a mistake. But basically, even playing by their own rules, the mistake they made was very large, and Capitol Lake does not even have theoretical violations of water quality. By my calculation, and please, I urge you to review it. But who cares? It's the modern lake that concerns us. Dissolved oxygen levels are always extraordinarily high, top to bottom, every day of every year. Comparing it to a fictitious natural lake of bygone years is meaningless and misleading. In reality, there are no oxygen deficiencies in modern Capitol Lake. 5, okay, sure, good. Next one, please. Here's another problem. And this shows, if you can't see it, great rafts of plants floating on the surface of Capitol Lake in about, I think it was, I don't know, the date is on there somewhere, June sometime. Those plants are capturing both phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients. Occasional shortages of nitrogen stop the growing season for the plants. The plants never run short of phosphorus. Nitrogen is by far the more damaging to Butt Inlet, but the Department of Ecology focuses on phosphorus, which is really irrelevant to the ecology of the lake. So that's all I'll say about that. I will say one more thing. Everyone thinks, me included, the lake looks a little unsightly during the summer. It's got these great rafts of weeds floating on it. Well, here's another place where aquatic harvesting could, one, take nutrients physically out of the lake by taking the plants out, and also improve its appearance. Next one, please. And we're at the end. Where do we go from here? Science gets reviewed. It really does get reviewed. And you're not home free until the reviewers say, yeah, this works. We must engage some independent reviewers to assess both Department of Ecology's modeling report and my use and misuse of Butt Inlet model review, and a few other things. It's essential that somebody outside, somebody with a distant view, somebody who's not too close to it, review the things that are written about it. That's essential. You might post a link to my report along the Department of Ecology's supplemental modeling report on the DES Capitol Lake page. And really critical, conduct a year-long field study of the organic carbon production and release by Capitol Lake and the lake's real-life, real-time relationship to dissolved oxygen in Butt Inlet. And then finally, base no policy decisions on Department of Ecology's supplemental report and my report until all of these are reviewed. And the last one, very last one, the top line is also the bottom line. Capitol Lake is part of a system of water, all of which are great. They're beautiful. They make our community. The lake is one of the healthiest lakes in our county from the oxygen standpoint and from other standpoints. The lake takes tons of nutrients out of the Deschutes River every summer, and keeps them there until after the growing season when they don't do any harm when they get away. The lake produces Puget Sound from oxygen depletion, the lake protects Puget Sound from oxygen depletion. The lake supports a healthy aquatic ecosystem. The lake is clean enough for swimming, sailing, and kids fishing, and the Butt Inlet model misrepresents many of these positive features. Now I want to say that there are good things in the Butt Inlet model as well. The model really does track the trends of the data and can tell us what will happen if we make certain changes. It just can't tell us to the second decimal place. Thank you.
Thank you. We've a couple minutes before the 25 minutes are over, and a few minutes for questions and answers. Questions and answers? Thoughts?
just have a question. I'm sorry I missed the discussion on best available science and where we're gonna move forward with that. Was there anything that would relate to Dr. Milne's presentation and how we're gonna handle science that's brought to us in this matter?
So, Gary or Jesse, did you hear the question? Perhaps you-
Oh, no, that's okay. We don't have our microphones. I was just curious, I apologize for missing the discussion, this morning on best available science and how we're gonna handle that. So I didn't know if we had a way to, accept, science of this format through our process. How's that gonna look?
Yes, so the reports that were referred to would come in and be compiled with the technical documentation list that we have. And offline, we had some suggestions that perhaps we just categorize in our table where the sources of material came from, but it would be brought into that compiled list.
Okay, thank you.
And then what our process next will be to
Have that
select,
updated list.
update the list and have a selection criteria for in the EIS, how would different science be assessed? For what is best available science? Are there other questions? Other questions? Once?
Would you take one from the audience?
I think we're gonna do it right here at the table, have this a conversation with the executive work group instead. Thank you. Hearing none, why don't we do a stretch break for a minute or two? We've got a 5-minute allocation for a stretch break. And then we'll have our next three presenters actually, as I said, come up. Thank you very much, Dr. Milne.
Thank you for listening, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Marco. Thank you.
You should have got one. Do we have a?
I do. I gave one to Carrie. Do you want, I gave one to Carrie.
Oh, you, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, you got it.
Have a seat. You're in charge. You'll make sure that things get. How many copies did you make?
I've got about 7.
Oh, okay.
And I can either give them to him now or just
It's you first. Him. So you know about when he'll be through. That yeah, you can then just.
well, when he introduces you, when you introduce him,
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine, Bob.
when you introduce him, you can say we've got a handout and we can hand these out.
Okay.
These are just as part.
Of the,
That way, if we give them to them now, they're going to be reading while we're talking.
Because I was thinking, I'm sorry, I should have asked you to make 10 copies.
I did.
You did.
Yeah, I've got extra.
Oh, good for the consultant and staff.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have. Yeah.
Sound like you did real good. I just came in a little bit right at the end. That's right. Right. Hi. Absolutely.
These are the copies.
does this,
I don't think we need that.
you don't think so? Okay.
Did Dave use it?
No, he didn't, and we could, it's okay.
I don't care if the audience uses it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
Oh, boy. Well, okay. I think I know what I'm doing.
I'm glad you do. I really like this. That you can take, whoop,
Yeah.
yeah, that you can take to the bank.
Well, that's what I hope.
Yeah, yeah.
So you may want to move that microphone.
Dennis, you don't have any zip drive files, do you?
No,
Okay.
no.
Just that.
No.
And you have, what, 2? Where's your zip drive?
You know, 5-minute stretch breaks always take 10 minutes.
So it's 12. We can start in a couple minutes. So we're going to start about 12:38. Jack,
Very
so that's 12:40. That would be 1:20 as the end, right? Yeah. Is that your? Oh.
And, there you go, for folks who are in the room, we are reconstituted the, sound system. It sounds like we're adjusting. I'll keep talking and see whether that keeps happening. Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3, that's probably a little better to hear us. We have a little feedback on it. Try again to see whether that takes the feedback away. Okay, so our second little panel, Jack Havens and Bob Coleman from CLIPA on summary of relevant studies, the 3-phase lake and urban watershed management plan, and Dennis Curry, also from CLIPA, cost information of various options. So I tried to, you're all from CLIPA, but you have several different topics, and we're going to be taking this away together. We've allocated 40 minutes here and then 5-minute questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you. Not yet. There will be later. Yeah. I think I've met everyone earlier today. I'm Bob Pullman, member of CLIPA. Also a member of Ecology's Deschutes Estuary TMDL advisory group. So I put this on the board because this is the DES plan to look at the various goals that are important in this study. And so we're going to use that. We're going to try and touch on each of those as we go through our discussion, because I think that's what you're most familiar with. But in particular, what we want to do is move beyond the incomplete and now outdated CLAMP report, which I heard some references to earlier today, and focus on the more recent information, as well as include information that hasn't been addressed in those earlier reports. But first, I want to provide a little context. We all know our community faces some significant social problems, infrastructure needs, maintenance issues, things like education, drug addiction, homelessness, global warming, economic development. They're in the news every day, and we're all searching for solutions to these problems. But in the case of the management of Capitol Lake, we've got it backwards. The folks that are advocating for an estuary or a dual basin, they have a solution, but they're still looking for the problem. And this is backwards. It's what I used to call the tail wagging the dog. And clearly there are many issues that need to be addressed regarding Capitol Lake. But the critical question is, do any of these issues rise to such a level that the community should invest the enormous resources and take the many risks of untested assumptions and unpredictable outcomes to make such a fundamental change in this urban area, which is a change that's irreversible. Once the dam is out, it's out. And we believe that rather than that approach, that an incremental approach should be taken, taking advantage of the current benefits that we have in Capitol Lake and working to improve in areas where we can best direct our limited resources. We believe that's more prudent, and we believe that's actually the essence of adaptive management. Now looking at these goals, the yellow circles, the one I want to talk about first is sediment management. And in particular, the need for an initial or what's called a maintenance dredge. I put the topic first because it's probably the one area that we have the most agreement among all the people that are involved, regardless of the position with respect to an estuary or dual basin or retaining the lake. Most people agree that at least an initial or maintenance dredge has to be the first step in the process. This year marks 30 years since the lake was dredged. Each year, about 35,000 cubic yards of sediment come down the Deschutes into Capitol Lake and Lower Butt Inlet. Most of that comes down in a handful of storm events each winter. With respect to retaining Capitol Lake, dredging is necessary if we want to have any chance to restore recreational activities, and long-term, if we want to avoid having a freshwater swamp in the middle of our urban area, because that's where we're headed. If the choice is made to remove the tide lock, either for an estuary or a dual basin, a failure to reduce the amount of sediment that's backed up in those 30 years would be disastrous for Olympia, for the waterfront, and for the port. The Corps of Engineers has done an estimate, it's part of the CLAMP study. Approximately 6 feet of sediment will accumulate every 10 years if we don't take any action to find a way to capture that sediment. So that's 6 feet every 10 years. We've got 30 years of accumulated non-dredge. You can do that math. With that background, we're advocating that we at least move this initial dredge to a fast track position and not wait for consensus on all the various issues for the long-term management planning. DES estimates that's going to take several years. We feel because of the general consensus in this regard, this is an area where even controversy averse agency personnel and elected officials could still move forward with minimal exposure. As for the longer term goal of sediment management, I think we can look at the alternatives of lake versus estuary. We maintain that using Capitol Lake as a sediment trap is preferable to eliminating the dam, which also includes eliminating part of the isthmus, and letting the sediment pulse into Lower Butt Inlet. And there are two good reasons for that. First, the cost of dredging in Capitol Lake is a fraction of the cost of dredging in the boat basins, around all the parks that we have, and in the port area. And also impacting dredging costs is the cost of disposal, which in the lake has relatively clean sediments as opposed to dredging in Lower Butt Inlet that has contaminated sediments. So there's costs of the actual dredging, and there's costs of the disposal that are much higher with an estuary. Probably more important than that even though is the ability of a sediment trap like Capitol Lake to capture the quantities of sediment that would otherwise pulse into Lower Butt Inlet. by capturing them in the lake, we have a chance to strategically dredge the material when it's best for us. If it pulses into Bud Inlet because of a major storm, then we have to take immediate action, which in recent years exposes us to delays, maybe even legal challenges. That results in higher costs and the potential to put Bud Inlet off limits until that dredging occurs. So let me change gears. We've got a couple other items up there: fish and wildlife, protecting fish passage. Jack is going to review those issues and provide some new information to help clarify how we can move forward with those improvements.
Thanks, Bob. Could you get a photograph, please? Yeah, I'm going to discuss the PISNERP decisions, our strategies to increase salmon numbers, and our plan to restore and maintain recreational opportunities around Capitol Lake, particularly swimming. First of all, the PISNERP decision to not fund the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Project.
Jack, for our audience, can you explain what PISNERP is?
I was just getting to that.
Oh, sorry.
It's one of my favorite things to do because it's such a goofy name. PISNERP means, or is an acronym for Puget Sound Estuary Restoration Project. It's a study partnership between WDFW and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a group of experts that have meticulously studied Puget Sound nearshore ecology since 2001. They're kind of like Dr. Milne in that PISNERP's greatest values include its independence and its degree of expertise. Its mission includes evaluating significant ecosystem degradation and recommending only those selected for funding. While we at CLIPA value estuaries in general, we recognize that the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Project is quite unique. We have to agree with PISNERP, which has rejected this project twice for funding. For me and many others, the most meaningful reason supporting this rejection is the project's cost-benefit ratio. The values of the lake to the community and to water quality are very, very high. The cost of removing the dam are also very, very high. Funding simply couldn't be justified given the limited environmental benefits received. That's not to say there are not some environmental benefits. The inference is that alternative projects would be far better investments for improving Puget Sound. Investments like stormwater runoff abatement, the #1 problem in Puget Sound. Reduction of pharmacologicals and other toxins flowing into the sound and damaging our orcas, our seals, our sea otters, and our salmon, and finally finding their way into the bodies of we humans, and particularly our children. One of the most fundamental principles that I'm aware of in any effective management team is its ability to appreciate and utilize expertise. Our experts have been clear. I'd like to now talk about our understanding of the relationship between Capitol Lake and its Chinook salmon run. You know, the Columbia River dams have been blamed for being detrimental to juvenile salmon due to their tall spillways and turbine intakes. We must all understand that Capitol Lake's tide lock has neither of these. So it seems quite probable that the tide lock has little effect on these juvenile fish. But how about the lake itself? Over the years, we have been led to believe, me in particular, that the lake has a negative effect on these juvenile salmon. The reason? It's just common knowledge. So let's consider the following scientifically derived information. Lake Washington in Seattle has characteristics similar to Capitol Lake. Both are in an urbanized area, both add immensely to the community's quality of life, both produce substantial populations of aquatic insects, and both produce hatchery Chinook. By the way, both systems contain New Zealand mud snails. In 2006, an article was published by the American Fisheries Society entitled Diet and Bioenergetics of Lake Rearing Juvenile Salmon in Lake Washington. 6 researchers representing the University of Washington, NOAA Fisheries, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife authored this study using 60 references in its writing. Allow me to read the following excerpts from this article. By the way, we found no evidence of this in CLAMP's bibliography, so it could be that all you folks that are associated with CLAMP are hearing this for the first time. Here's the first excerpt. Despite the heavily altered nature of Lake Washington and the relatively short time Chinook salmon have used this system, reminding you of Capitol Lake, feeding and growth performance of juvenile salmon in the habitats of Lake Washington were comparable to those for Chinook salmon rearing in estuarine and riverine environments. 2. Efforts to rebuild Chinook populations in this basin should therefore focus on influence of other lake-related factors such as predation, etc. In other words, don't focus on the habitat being a lake. It's okay if it's a lake. Focus on such things as predation. We all need to recognize that removing the tide block would triple the number of predation compression points, which I'll show you momentarily. Go ahead and change. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to now offer 6 strategies to increase salmon numbers while retaining Capitol Lake. I just have enough time to touch on these. I can't go into detail. Number 1 is what I just mentioned, limiting the compression points to 1 by using the lake as opposed to 3 by converting it to an estuary. A compression point is nothing but a narrowing of the channel. And what this does, it allows predators such as seals and cormorants and hairy the heron to just sit back and expend very, very little energy and pick off the prey. We currently, with the lake, have 1 compression point right there at 5th Avenue. If we take the dam out, then we allow for an ingress of seawater, brackish water, so that we have a compression point here, that's 1, a compression at I-5, that's 2, and a compression point at Tumwater Falls Fish Ladder, that's 3. Now, I'm not saying they will triple the number of fish that are lost to predation, but I think we have to admit it's extremely significant. Number 2, adopt and modify CLIPA's Percival Creek Rechanneling Project to more easily allow ingress and egress of wild and hatchery salmon tidal flows. Very quickly, and this is what we did in response to the Ruckelshaus request of trying to find different ways to alleviate any problems that may or may not exist. This is a rechannel right here that goes directly from Percival Creek to Budd Inlet. Now, the pictorial here is not very good. This will have a great deal more sinuosity. But the idea of that is to allow a lot more ease of stray juvenile salmon, whose numbers we really don't know, to come into this area and utilize that for rearing or even spawning. Number 3, continue pursuing riparian and in-stream salmon habitat restoration projects in 3 different areas. Number 1 is the 52 miles above Tumwater Falls. Sue Patton and I are already on a project the golf course area to help with sediment control. Second area would be Lower Percival Creek itself. Fish and Wildlife says that we should look at that and perhaps make that a coho restoration project. And the third area would be the 4 to 6 major streams that are flowing into Butt Inlet that might be used as salmon resources. Number 4, dredge Capitol Lake to make it even more compatible for salmonids. As Bob mentioned, it's been 25 years since, well, it's 25 years overdue. It's very well understood and documented that a dredged lake is more beneficial to salmon than an undredged lake. Number 5, provide for maximum aquatic freshwater insect populations by retaining the dam. And 6, proceed with the hatchery at Pioneer Park, which would be right in this area. With the following understanding, and I'm going to read you a statement here that I hope everybody thinks about. It seems questionable and certainly inconsistent to industrialize the lower Deschutes River with hatchery infrastructure and its further threats to water quality, while at the same time advocating for the removal of Capitol Lake with its significant benefits to the water quality and to the hundreds of thousands in our community who enjoy it. We should share this marvelous asset and continue its use for all of us in a responsible manner. That is the essence of CLIPA. Lastly, I want to just briefly talk about maintaining and restoring recreational use in Capitol Lake. These are statements and observations. They're not rocket science. It's what I think is commonly understood. It's commonly accepted that walking increases longevity in humans. American Cancer Society says that, and dozens of other institutions agree. Capitol Lake attracts a very high number of walkers, runners, joggers, and dog walkers. It's our central park, our premier amenity for social cohesion. I probably go around that lake 6 times every week, and so do thousands of others. I'm guessing here, but I don't think I see even 5% of these Capitol Lake numbers at Mud Bay or East Bay, Mud Flats. I'd also mention that motorized boating probably has similar benefits. But regarding swimming, by a huge margin, the number one question asked us about the status of Capitol Lake by community residents is, when can we swim again in the lake? Olympia and Thurston County have no centrally located public freshwater swimming areas. The community wants more parks and recreational facilities, as evidenced by the passage of the recent funding initiative. Thanks to Cheryl and Mr. Miller, appreciate that very much. Reestablishing Capitol Lake swimming and non-motorized boating facility is a reasonable undertaking for the enjoyment and health of our citizenry. Thanks to more effective stormwater runoff management, we now understand that this project is within our grasp. All bacterial counts over the last 14 years have been acceptable for swimming. Reestablishing this facility in the Northern Basin would be of enormous benefit to our community. And now I want to introduce Dennis Curry, who is going to discuss costs and impacts of both alternatives, and maybe a third alternative. I'm going to hand this out to you guys.
Yes, Jack's handing out a 5-page presentation. I don't have any slides. This way you can take it along with you, you can study it. Also, we've provided the backup information to the consultants through DES in terms of detailed spreadsheets, which contain all the assumptions used in developing the cost figures. Actually, my background is in cost and data analysis. I've been doing it since 1960, which is a long time. That's where my bread and butter was. And so I've just applied my talents to the issues of okay, what are the costs of the various alternatives? The summary sheet gives you a quick overview indication that the cost of creating the estuary is approximately $264 million, a bit over $250 million. Creation of the dual basin approaches $300 million. There are various options in there that I'll talk about briefly. Managing Capitol Lake over a 20-year period is estimated to cost $43 million. It's not without cost, but it's quite a bit more reasonable cost. Also, I'll touch on the annual economic value, and I want to say annual economic value of the working West Bay waterfront. That's a value to the community, many, many jobs, payrolls, and taxes for our local governments. The economic value of recreational marine boating is annually approaching $30 million. The economic value of the Port of Olympia Marine Terminal, according to a recent port study, is $100 million. So you have a total annual economic value of the West Bay waterfront of around $130 million. We're not talking about something ephemeral here. We're talking about jobs. We're talking about real benefits. Okay, the next page, I discussed briefly the estimated cost to create an estuary. And I'm not going to read everything here. I don't have the time, but you can read it at your leisure. These estimates are based upon the engineering studies that were done for Clamp by Moffatt and Nichol engineers out of Seattle, Washington. Two adjustments were made to their base assumptions. One was a Fifth Avenue bridge that would be similar to the Fourth Avenue bridge, which was not what they had considered. They'd considered a freeway-style bridge. And the second was slightly higher dredging estimates that PISNERP subsequently estimated. Costs are broken down into three main categories. First of all, the public process, permitting, and engineering. The consultants estimated a 4 to 5 year period for such a massive undertaking, and estimated that when you apply the cost adjustment factors that they recommend would be about $14 million. Construction costs, including oversight taxes, etc. And these are very comprehensive. It isn't just taking out the dam. When you go through those narrow openings with the runoff, you have to protect the freeway bridge, you have to protect the railroad bridge, you have to protect the Fourth Avenue bridge from the effect of scouring. In addition, unless you're willing to put up with no Deschutes Parkway for a number of years, the consultants recommend going uphill with it to the roundabout. A difficult project, but I guess it's doable. That also adds to the cost. Also, and put this in perspective, before you start anything else, you have to dredge close to 500,000 cubic yards to rechannel the Deschutes River. Else you end up with a flood of silt, virtually totally mudflatting Bud Inlet. So that's where you start out, and then you have the bridge costs, dismantling the tide lock, etc. Now, understand that if this type of project were to be undertaken, these estimates were based on 2006 data brought forward. The first thing that would need to be done is to have another comprehensive engineering study that is likely to come up with some different figures. So consider these as approximates. Okay, moving to the next page, the dual basin. I think a lot of people would like a dual basin. It just seems to, gosh, that covers all the bases. Well, the consultants looked at a variety of options, settling on a steel dividing wall surrounded by rubble. The steel to hold the rubble in place, and they considered a variety of intake and outflow options for river water to come in and for tide water to come in and mix in the area. They estimated that the added costs above dredging, above the, just removing the dam, a little over 17.5%. When you apply that to the estimated project cost of $186 million, you come up with $219.5. Now at this point I ought to mention, what is this other cost? The ongoing Butt Inlet dredging. Well, one of the things that Clamp did not do was to estimate, even though their consultant brought it up, they did not estimate any costs of dredging in Butt Inlet to account for the silt that would come in. Now the $77 million is based upon the amount of silt that would come in the subsequent 10 years using the figures from the 2014 dredging experience of the Olympia Yacht Club. It costs approximately 3 times as much per cubic yard to dredge in Butt Inlet than it does in Capitol Lake because of the dioxins and other harmful heavy metals that are in the soil in Butt Inlet. So this is an ongoing obligation. The Corps of Engineers has said in their decision not to fund the dam removal project is that they can't allow the silt to come down and to block up the navigation channel because it's going to cost the Corps more money to keep it clean. So we're inferring from that that they're not going to give a permit unless there is a mechanism, some kind of structure, governmental or structure, that would be able to raise the money through assessments to different governments to provide for ongoing dredging in Butt Inlet if you remove the dam under either for a dual basin or simply dam removal. Okay, the next piece of paper that I have there are the estimated costs to maintain Capitol Lake. CLIPA in 2011 came up with a white paper that was based upon engineers' estimates. Our group contains a lot of people who have a base of knowledge, including the late Harvey Kaiser, who was a capital budget analyst for the state of Washington, and estimating the costs of periodic dredging in Capitol Lake. The first biennium's cost, which I think, as Bob said, regardless of whether this decision gets put off out into the future again because of issues and the like, the first biennium really ought to take place. For a decent dredge that hasn't been done in 25, 30 years, an initial dredge of 175,000 cubic yards, which is based on Floyd Snyder's estimate of permitting, initial creation for staging, total $6.5 million. Now, if the decision is made, yes, we're going to maintain the lake, okay, the next 8 years for a total of 10-year costs come to $21.5 million. The second 10 years, and you'll see it's a little bit higher, is going to come to $22 million for a total 20-year cost of $43.5 million. Now, I want to note that these amounts are based upon a mitigated determination of non-significance. That is what Fish and Wildlife concluded in the creation of the hatchery up the Deschutes River. That means there was no necessity for an EIS, an environmental impact statement. Should a full environmental impact statement be required, costs could increase by approximately $2 million, and the project would be delayed by 2 to 3 years, which would further add to project costs due to inflation. So we'd be talking more in the neighborhoods of $50 million. And it's the case with all the alternatives. These amounts are not broken down by fund source. We don't know whether the state would bear it all. We don't know how much the city would be asked, county would be asked, the other city, the port. That's another aspect of this whole study. 5 minutes, well, that's fine, no problem. Be done in 3. The last page deals with the economic impacts associated with a managed, was that the total? I should stop? Oh, okay. No, but you need to come back. Okay, I'll be real quick. You have 2 aspects here of economic benefits. The recreational marine boating industry and the economic impact of the Port of Olympia. Not going to go into the second. The port has recently produced a document that you can refer to. The recreational marine boating industry estimates were based upon a study done by BST Associates in Bothell, Washington, of a new marina for the Port of Bellingham. We converted that amount to an amount per slip. We then applied that to the number of slips in West Bay and came up with the amount of economic value per slip. Also calculated related taxes, fees paid to DNR, etc. That concludes my presentation, and I want to turn it back to Bob, who will talk about flood risk and especially in the light of possible sea level rise.
Thanks, Thomas. Try and get through this pretty quickly. We may run a little over into the question and answer. But, first of all, we refer to the dam at Fifth Avenue, but it's really a tide lock. It's actually designed that way rather than a traditional river dam. And using this tide lock function, DES has been able to come up with a set of criteria to manipulate the water level on Capitol Lake to prevent or at least mitigate some of the flood potential in downtown Olympia. This potential occurs, and you can kind of visualize, when you have a lot of water flow from a storm event in the wintertime, at the same time that you have a high tide, the tide backs up the water in Capitol Lake and you can have an overflow. And by what DES does is lower the level in Capitol Lake. They do that in anticipation of the high tide. If they lower it a couple feet, then you get about an hour and a half with a typical storm event, about an hour and a half before the lake fills back up. And then you have another 3 feet up to the Ark of Statehood, the top of that from the normal level. So with those 2, you have about 4 hours of time, and that spans most of the high tide events that we have. Now that doesn't say that DES can accommodate every single one, but one of the key ones was back a little over a year ago in February of 2014. We had one of the highest storm events that had been recorded. We had a tide level of 15 and a half feet, and the lowering of the lake ahead of time prevented any flooding in the downtown area. So it does work. It's done regularly. It's done 3 or 4 times or more every year. So that's how the lake helps the flooding potential. But, and it probably goes without saying, if you don't have a dam and a Capitol Lake there, then when you have that storm event and you have that high tide, the tide is going to come into that estuary. It's going to have an immediate impact on downtown, and there's going to be absolutely no flood protection. So the dam does offer some help. But, and this is kind of a segue into sea level rise, longer term, Olympia is going to be looking at sea level rise, and in fact, you've started to do some planning in that regard. And the use of the lake will help for a while, but ultimately, as the tides get higher and higher, that's not going to be enough. And Olympia is going to have to face the hard choice that many cities have to face. Do we somehow protect the town, or do we abandon it? And those are really the choices that Olympia faces. But really, there isn't a choice, because Olympia's already voted. Olympia's put the city hall downtown. They put the hands-on children's museum, the lot plant, lots of parks, market rate housing. they've already committed to the downtown area for the long-term future. So what that says to me is that protection in the form of dikes or tide gates or barriers of some type is going to be required. And this leads to a further question, which I'll read. Why would we incur the enormous expense to remove the existing protection in the form of the Fifth Avenue tide lock, when longer term we'll need these same resources to develop the sea level rise protection for downtown Olympia? And Dennis talked about the magnitude of the resources that would be required to remove the dam. So I'll entertain questions later if we have time, but I want to jump very quickly into a subject. I don't know if, okay, if you could put that original chart up, that was changed last week, and when we first looked at it, we hadn't considered talking about invasive species, but that's now an item that's on that chart, so I wanted to briefly address it. And really, when you talk invasive species, you're talking about the New Zealand mud snails. So I think a little history is worth noting. Mud snails were first recognized in the Snake River in Idaho in the late 80s. They spread from there. They have spread throughout the western part of the United States and some reason leapfrog to the Great Lakes. They're very prominent in the Great Lakes. But today, these mud snails are in almost every river in western United States. They're in Yellowstone. They're in the Grand Canyon. Closer to home, they're in the Columbia and they're in Lake Washington. And the interesting thing is they also have infested the many marine waters up and down the Pacific coast. And that's a key element. And I think somebody mentioned that this morning, that there's this idea floating around out there that, gee, we put in an estuary, that's going to kill all these mud snails and that's going to go away. And that's just not true. They exist in marine environments. They'll continue to persist in this environment, whether we have a lake or whether we have an estuary. And what most communities, most areas have chosen to do is to manage it. Let's see what I wanted to cover here. I wanted to just mention, in case you doubt that, I don't know if you get down to Grace Harbor County, but the Chehalis River estuary, it's actually called the Chehalis River Surge Plain, which is an area south of Montesano. It's brackish water. It's owned by DNR. DNR actually has a recreation site there. They have a canoe trail that goes through this area, and they have a canoe launch site. They've chosen to manage the mud snail in that area, and the mud snail is prevalent in that area. So maybe it's possible that DES could talk to DNR about recreation and maybe find a way to remove the quarantine on Capitol Lake and actually move forward to using that as a recreation opportunity. To my knowledge, Capitol Lake is the only mud snail infested area that's quarantined throughout the United States. I know of no other place that they've chosen to deal with it that way. So that concludes the comments about the various items. I just wanted to summarize by saying, together with Dave Milne's comments on water quality and the functions of the ecosystem, Dennis, Jack, and I have tried to provide some current information for the goals in the DES Phase 1 implementation. We're in full agreement that the adaptive management approach is the best way to move forward, has the best promise of being successful, and we interpret this adaptive management as being incremental changes to optimize the existing Deschutes River, Capitol Lake, Bud Inlet watershed, while still retaining the many benefits to the community of this asset that we have. So hopefully we have enough time for a couple questions.
for all that information. We're ready to go for any questions.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, and they, oh yes, they've already been provided to the consultants.
Thank you for all that information.
Overload.
It's a lot.
We'll take a,
You're welcome.
15-minute stretch break and,
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's not an easy, if it were easy, it'd be done already.
That's right, that's right.
Oh,
Thank
just-
you.
We have, Jack and I have notes from our discussion that we'll hand out to all of you.
Great, that would be
So-
awesome, thank you.
I was wondering if there's ever a chance that I could sit down and talk with you. Can you just
Sure, sure. Yeah, I'm out of here.
chance I could ever talk to you?
Sure.
What I had said,
Well, I hope that wasn't too much of an information overload.
I don't know. I think they just not knowingly.
I have another job. No,
Only there's some sort of way to contain the water, a dam as it were.
Yeah, damn it. Let's hope they didn't all go home safe all the time. You too, I'll see you next
you're
time.
both presenting.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm Paul.
Hi.
Helen, hi. And so you're kind of watching how this dance is going, right? So,
We've been way in the back.
okay, so there's 15 minutes out, 10 minutes of presentation. If you want to, wait for the questions at the end, you can. If you want to take it while you're going through, you can look at it.
Okay.
What I've been doing is, so like about a minute or so before your 10 minutes is up, catching your eye, saying about a minute left. But that's until you get into the last 5 minutes.
At whatever point.
I was going to be super passive aggressive and just put a timer on.
Okay, so you're gonna divide the time between you.
Yeah.
So what I'll do is, when there's one, you have basically 10 minutes. So there's 1 minute left to your 10 minutes. I'll give whoever's speaking kind of the high side. But then there's a 5-minute period for Q&A or what happened today. So you can do that.
All right.
Oh, and I have handouts.
Yeah, you can just tell me to shut up at any point.
Shut up, Alan. Do we give these handouts to you? Yeah, well, we both have handouts. She's doing her own. I don't know what was appropriate. Is that what this is? Is that the slide? Is that the slide advance?
What? That's a microphone.
Oh, that's a microphone. How do we advance? Do we just have to? Whoever's driving the computer has to.
I want to make sure we have your material.
I handed it to her earlier today. It's a PowerPoint.
Carrie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That's it.
Do you want to hand your stuff out?
I already gave it to him to hand out.
Oh, okay.
That's my own staff work. We just know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So,
And I'd like to welcome the students from Lincoln. For the final presentation. It's gonna be a test, so you make pay attention now. Glad you joined us. And our next presentation is on the history of the Deschutes Estuary at Copper Lake, Emmett O'Connell and Helen Wheatley.
Wheatley, yeah, that's right. Okay, so, oh, you're speaking into the small one. Okay, well, okay, I guess if people can hear me, good.
Can you hear well enough? Give it a quick tap.
Okay, well, I'll just tell you first about the handout that I passed around there. And I'm going to read because it makes me faster, and I guess, you know, time is of the essence. So this handout is 3 related documents from the Washington State Archives. Well, actually, one of them is from the library, State Library, for you to look at your leisure because you're policy wonk types. And what it is it's a sort of a look at the very beginning of the timeline that you got this morning. The Deschutes, Unit 1 of the Deschutes Basin Project, which created the historical artifact of the dam and the lake. And among these documents is Olympia's first comprehensive planning document from 1946, written by an outside expert, Charles Elliott, who is maybe an even more significant figure in landscape and urban planning than the Olmsteds for this period. He worked on the mall in Washington, D.C., as well as other projects like that. There's his executive summary of the Deschutes Basin Plan specifically, and a letter from the mayor of Olympia regarding the position of the city on the project. So you can just read those at your leisure. I'm actually not going to talk about those. All right, so let's go to slide 1, although actually I'm probably going to skip over it. I actually wanted to bring this up as a kind of a historical document from 2009.
So long ago.
Just to raise the question of how we think about getting at similar kinds of questions about public opinion when we didn't in the era before public involvement and before surveys, and that's a part of what Emmett and I are here to help you to think about. And our message fundamentally, I think Emmett would agree, is that there have always been arguments about the Deschutes Estuary and Basin. Some of the results you can see nowadays, others you can't, but it's important to search for all the voices in a broad context if you want them to somehow inform your goals moving forward. And today I want to consider a group of people during this kind of industrializing era of the first part of the 20th century up until this, immediately post-World War II period that we don't see in the planning documents that you have before you, for example, people who like to fish around here. There were a lot of them. A 1944 sports column in the Seattle Times reported on opening day, for instance, anglers on the Deschutes reported the stream was so crowded after 6 o'clock in the morning there was hardly room to fish. There were over 1,000 active members of the local Poggy Club. The Chamber of Commerce even had a Fish and Wildlife Committee, and its first 2 recommendations in 1949 were to stock the river with cutthroat trout and stock the basin with rainbows. The basin, they said, will make a fine home for rainbows. Okay, so next slide. This is getting to this question of how we might we look at this value of clean water that is held so strongly in the Olympia survey as a historical matter. We know a fair bit about the commercial oysters around here. I won't recap that history, but we can dig a little deeper, to pardon the pun, into how people enjoyed Olympia's estuary as a haven for bivalves, and we can consider the gooey duck. In about 1880, a man named Henry Hemphill sent some shell specimens to the conservator of the conchological section of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia with the following description. I send you a fine large specimen of this species. Its flesh, I think, is the most delicious of any bivalve I've ever eaten, not excepting the best oysters. The boys at Olympia call them gooey ducks. They dig them on a certain sandbar at extreme low tide and sell them to a merchant who ships them to Portland, Oregon, where they readily sell at fair prices. Back in those days, bivalves were considered the pride of the city, especially the festive gooey duck of the Olympia Flats. Some of the young up-and-coming bachelors of Olympia lived in a home on Water Street that they called the Gooey Duck Club. The Olympia Elks featured the gooey duck as the highlight of their annual spring banquet. The geoduck was featured in their very first newsletter in 1918. By this time, they were assembling a veritable army armed with stake shovels and sacks to dig in the lowest spring tides during what the Portland Oregonian once referred to as the moon of the geoduck. These armies dug enough for the Olympia Shriners to even feature 400 of them at a banquet of a national meeting in Portland in 1920. Next slide. The kinds of fish who really mattered here were trout, cutthroat trout, salmon, and forage fish, and for kids, perch. Mary Schoenweiler Knopfler, in her memoir of childhood on the waterfront in the 1930s, The View from My Roller Skates, remembered there was a smelt run between the Oyster House and the boardwalk at Percival Landing. Usually there'd be a quantity of the tasty little silver creatures flipping around on the dock. You had to gather them quickly into your bucket. They would love to jump back into the water, and some would make it. 3 or 4 dips, you'd rush them home to Mama for dinner. At least that's how we handled the situation. Mary also caught poggies in a bucket and threw them back, and she and her sister would take starfish and sea cucumbers home to rot in a sort of aquarium in the woodshed. Daddy removed the smelly things after a few days. So that was a girl talking about her wanderings around the area of basically Little Hollywood and, sort of the frontage where Grandpa's ice cream is nowadays. Around the turn of the century, one favorite fishing spot was the West Side Mill, where 10-pound Chinook could commonly be found in the spring. Another was a sewer outfall where the herring apparently liked to congregate. Let's go to the next one. I'll skip a little bit here. By far the most significant spot for kids was Percival. Oh, no, let's go back then. I guess I didn't have the other slide I intended. One of the most significant spots for kids was Percival Creek. Mary liked to go up there to sit by the hour catching more poggies, but it was quite a scene when the chums showed up. A November 1912 article in the Morning Olympian described a small army of men and boys with hooks fastened stationary to rake handles, broom handles, large bamboo poles, pike poles, and the common or garden variety of poles, who visited Percival Creek almost daily and waylay the festive chum ascending the stream. More than one citizen of Olympia has been moved to arm himself with a spear or landing hook and hie to Percival Creek and smaller streams up which the salmon run. Some of these are equipped with a sack into which they thrust any of the quarry they may land, and thus convey the same back to the city and to some waiting kitchen. Many people visit the spawning grounds each season just to watch the fish pounding their way upstream, over submerged logs and through the tangles of brush and roots till they reach some quiet spot that suits their fancy. And then spring at Percival Creek was a time for trout fishing. A May 1946 notice about the opening of the stream fishing season noted that the Upper Deschutes River will in all probability receive most attention, but the youngsters, however, have always made Percival Creek their favorite. And there are those oldsters who say the kids can catch more trout in Percival than they can with their best gear and efforts in the Deschutes. The fact is, despite the many changes that came to Olympia and Tumwater with the growth of industrialization, many residents remain strongly attached to the Deschutes Basin and its streams. Do I have time?
Yeah, about a minute and a
A
half.
minute, okay.
Well, for us, total.
Freeway slide. Oh, that's total?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness, we'll go.
Okay.
Go.
So let's
For
go
heaven's
ahead a
sakes.
few slides. We're gonna.
Oh,
Okay.
you like the stories. Okay, well, I knew the kids were coming. Okay, well, the freeway. Let's get that freeway slide up there. Although planners and boosters spoke with casual ease of filling in the cove, plans by the State Highway Department to do that as part of I-5 construction in the 50s brought protests from sports fishermen. Margaret McKenney and the Audubon Society, and even a young man who, like others, had spent happy days in Percival Creek, protested the filling of the cove in order to build I-5. 18-year-old Peter McCreary liked to fish for trout and salmon, and he liked it so much he became a marine biology student at the University of Washington. Starting presumably around when he was 12 or 13, every month of the year since the dam was made, he wrote in 1956, I've spent as much time as I possibly could watching fish activities at Percival Creek and in the cove just south of where the stream enters the lake. He studied spawning coho and chinook that had been introduced to the stream in the 1940s. They had abundant food in the water, he said, at the mouth of the stream. And even after the dam went in, the water was still about 10 feet deep, and the chinook fingerlings of the Deschutes actually congregated there to grow. If the cove were lost, he said, the young chinook would have nowhere to go, but what he called the barren lake. Of all the arguments about the cove, his was probably the most influential. The State Fisheries Department turned it, in fact, into a fish pen for young salmon for many years. And that's pretty much what I have to say. There's one more slide. My final point, very quickly, is simply that by this time, and even through his own work as a child, the old fishing ways had to give way to new forms of recreation, which opens up a whole bunch of other stories that I could tell if I had an hour or two. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, next slide. So I'm going to talk about this idea of impounded Deschutes River. It predates the 1911 Capital Campus Plan by a few years. The first one was Leopold Schmidt proposed it in 1895 as a part of a way to move the beer product from his brewery out to the open water. 1897, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did work down here and observed the local support for the idea, using it as a, in their report, using it as a way to raft logs out of the waterway. In 1903, the most audacious plan was to actually build a lake with the dam across Budd Inlet at Priest Point Park. This was inspired, yeah, I know, right? Inspired by Lake Union and turning Lake Union into an industrial lake then. Next slide. So by the time Wilder and White came around, the lake idea was fairly old, and it was an idea based on industrialization, somehow better use of the water to facilitate economic use. And so there's a document that they call the Report a Group Plan that is their one document that specifically outlines a lake. And there's a lot of debate about what the Report of Group Plan is. And if you read it all the way through, it's obviously a response to questions from the local community of like, well, what do we do now? I mean, you guys have this plan for a capital campus. How do we respond to it? In an article in the Cornell Architect, and Helen actually found this is great, you see this quote that they're describing it, and that it was a response to a request from influential citizens. We prepared a report containing suggestions to that end. The lake is one of these suggestions. Other suggestions include roads and the entire nature of the city itself. Next slide. The first actual attempt to build Capitol Lake happened a couple years after Wilder and White came to town, and it was by Doc Carline, P.H. Carline. And the intent there in the 1914-1915 was to actually access the west side. Up until this point, the west side was kind of hard to get. I mean, it wasn't hard to get to. There's a bridge, but the bridge just kept on falling into the water. So Carline had just completed, Carline and other city fathers had just completed the Carline fill on the east side. So they're like, well, this fill idea seems to work. These wild and white fellows have this great photo, this great picture of what a lake would look like. Let's build the lake. Unfortunately, Tumwater was against it. Next slide. This is literally my favorite headline of all times. Vigorously opposed closing the waterway. This is Tumwater's position, because Tumwater at this time was a seaport. They had open access to the water. The Deschutes Waterway is literally the Deschutes Waterway. It is a designated waterway from open water past Olympia to Tumwater. And Tumwater was against closing it, was against the fill again at the Deschutes Estuary. And this article is about the State Lands Commissioner taking their side, saying you can't close a waterway. It's against the law. And if somebody at the end of the waterway opposes it. Next slide. So this kind of put things on ice for a while. They got busy building the Capitol campus. They moved forward, and it wasn't until the 1930s, the Great Depression, Little Hollywood being built at the base of the Capitol, that people started agitating for it again. 1930s is when the first public money was expended to start buying up the tidelands. And this is a full-page ad. This is a portion of a full-page ad in the Olympian or the Olympia News, I forget which one, where they're talking about why this lake would be such a great idea. And this is admittedly only a portion of the ad, but this is, if you've never read anything written by Edwin Henderson, you should really find something written by Edwin Henderson. This guy is amazing. He's a real estate agent, but he's talking about his motivation for having this done is to sell houses, because they wanted to put houses around the edge of the Capitol Lake as sort of like a real estate. We'd help pay for this by selling these waterfront homes. Next slide. What, 1 minute? 2 minutes. Okay. This is just a quote from Charles Hood, the former Speaker of the House, talking about why the people in Olympia thought getting rid of Little Hollywood was a reason for Capitol Lake. Next slide. This is a great ad. This is from 1948. This is an ad taken out by the Olympia Chamber of Commerce, saying that once we have our dam, this won't be a scene anymore. This won't be something we see anymore. A lot of the details that I've been skipping through this pretty quickly, but I handed out the history that I wrote a few years back. I suppose the main point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of reasons why Capitol Lake was built. There's a lot of reasons why people thought that a lake would be a good idea where it is now, and that be careful, because I'm a person who, I love history and I love studying history, but in terms of making a decision going forward, that there's a risk of basing your decision now on a reason that was over 100 years ago. It was a reason from somebody over 100 years ago, and that understanding history doesn't mean that you're handcuffed by history, and that you need to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's that the decisions that were made years ago don't necessarily need to be decisions we make today. That we can understand history, but we can make our own path forward.
And there are always multiple voices in there.
Oh,
the other
absolutely.
Point that you make,
Yeah.
You left out so much, because there's no time.
Yeah.
The fact that they wanted to build a canal system that connected Olympia to the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
As a jobs program, instead of building the Bonneville Dam, they thought it would employ more people if they built a canal here instead. Or just a million stories.
What does it determine if you ignore history and you force it to repeat itself?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Wonderful stories.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Instead of taking a five special.
Sorry, I didn't get to hear the whole conversation. Thank you. So I got all here, got my reading material.
There you go.
Thanks.
Helen, you were talking about the prevalence of fish,
Yeah.
particularly in the personal
Mm-hmm.
creek, but also the shoots out before fish ladders.
Well, the whole story of how the fish ladders came in as a whole, I could spend an hour on that. It's amazing. No, one of the slides I wanted to show was them trucking salmon around the falls, because this whole idea of whether the upper Deschutes should be for trout, and it was considered, the Seattle Times called it one of the premier trout fishing streams of the Northwest. And there was a lot of interest in building a sports fishery around the trout, and that's one of the things that was lost and that we've kind of forgotten over time, is how important the trout were around here. But as early as the 1890s, people were kind of hand making their own fish ladders to try it. Before Olympia Power and Light came in, they put one in. In the 1940s, and the Poggy Club put in fish ladders at Percival Creek when they did to get to Black Lake, when the Black Lake ditch was dug. And so there was a lot of, and that kind of partnership between the sports fishermen and the fisheries and game departments was a really big story. It's a really big story around here. It was of much more interest to people than just about anything else.
When all those roads were occurring, were the railroad tracks and all those constraining points built, were they existing at that time?
The tracks along the west side and across the Trestle, yeah, they were there. Yeah, and if you look at pictures of the brewery at that time, you can see that what they called the shock basin for the estuary went way beyond where it is now. The other thing I want to say is that in the 40s, the fisheries department got involved in introducing the salmon runs because of the dam building throughout the Northwest. A bunch of federal money came in. And so then there was a very interesting argument in the local community about whether trout or salmon were the way to go. They planted salmon in 45 and 46. They came back in 49. And there was this amazing kind of clash of cultures where the chum salmon people came down and started whacking them and, hauling them in. And the folks who introduced them were saying, no, you can't do that. These are our salmon. They're not like the commons salmon, they're a different kind of salmon. These are salmon with a price on their head, because we've raised them in hatcheries. And that really pushed along this whole concept of building a fishway. So it came, actually, in fact, the legislation, the Fishway and the Deschutes Parkway came together in the minds of the legislature. And one legislator complained the fish are more popular than people because, there was no question about funding the fish ladder. That became, and the Deschutes Parkway was phase 2 of the Deschutes Basin project. So, yeah, like I said, there's just a million stories going on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final presenter, we do have 15 minutes, 10-minute presentation, final Q&A. Architecture history of Wilder, White, and Olmsted Brothers, Homes for Capital Lake, Alan Miller, North Capital Campus Heritage Park Development.
Hi there, everybody. I know everybody around the table. I've been president of the North Capital Campus Heritage Park Development Association since about 1990. We're the group that facilitated the citizens' input to create the North Capitol Campus Heritage Park over the years, starting in about 1986. So, next slide. So, it is clear in the history that Wilder and White and the Olmsted brothers intended to have Capitol Lake. Next slide. So, our design of the Wilder and White design for the Capitol Campus came out of the City Beautiful movement, which was a progressive era architectural movement right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries. And they came up with a revolutionary design to actually build a group of buildings as part of the Capitol Campus. The Capitol group of buildings, because all the 41 states before Washington had built one building, and they called it the Capitol, and within about 30, 40, 50 years, they outgrew it, and so they had to build annexes on it. I don't know if you've been to Sacramento to see the annex onto the Sacramento, California building. But so they actually came up with a scheme to build a set of buildings, and even though we've actually had to expand, we've actually been able to keep that beautiful group of buildings together. A reflecting lake was part of the plan, very similar to only 10 years before the McMillan plan for the National Mall. Think of the reflecting pond pool between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, the tidal basin out in front of the Jefferson Memorial. All of those are reflecting to reflect the beautiful buildings that are part of a design, such as the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and our buildings in Olympia. And then another concept was to build a promenade from the Temple of Justice out north to the water to actually physically connect to Puget Sound. And again, very similar to the 1901 McMillan plan for the National Mall, from Capitol Hill out to the Lincoln Memorial into the Potomac River. And then a final part of their design was to have a view corridor to connect to the borrowed landscapes of Capitol Lake, Puget Sound, and the Olympic Mountains out to the north and to the west, very similar to only 5 years before the Olmsteds had designed the Rainier Vista for the Alaska Yukon Pacific World's Fair, which is now our beautiful UW campus there at Montlake. Next slide. So this is their beautiful painting of the concept with the Capitol group of buildings up on the bluff, the promenade out to Puget Sound, Capitol Lake to reflect the beautiful buildings up on the hill. Next slide. Next slide. So, there is, and I gave you two handouts. You don't need to look at them now, but this is a quote from page 3 of the report of group plan of Walden White, August 29, 1911. A tide lock at the boulevard, which is now Fifth Avenue, would form a lake, and the whole effect would be visible from most parts of the city as well as from the sound. That I highlighted it in your handout. It's the legal size paper. So here we go. Here's what was intended, just like the reflecting pool in the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. We have this in Olympia. Next slide. And then in 1915, Walden White wrote an article for the American Architect magazine, which again is a handout to you. On page 346, I highlighted again where they refer to the south of the boulevard skirts the edge of a proposed freshwater lake secured by tide locks across the head of the sound, and will be a great addition to the city park system. And actually, over time, it has actually both become, it is state property to the south of Fifth, and then city property to the north of Fifth, and we have our beautiful Heritage Parks fountain, which we dedicated, hard to believe, 20 years ago, just a few days ago in May. So again, why don't you go back to that one? So again, that's the effect, is to have the reflecting of the dome up on the hill. And part of the design of Walden White, again, revolutionary, was to make this group of buildings look like one massive building which you can see from afar. Go ahead, next slide. So some of the secondary sources, Norm Johnston is a professor who unfortunately died at 96. He had a long life just last year, but he's the expert. This is the book that he wrote, The Audacious State Capitol and Its Builders. And this is a quote from his book. The late 1940s were to include the beautification of the expanse and the base of the Capitol Group, site to its north and west. The partners' plan saw this area as a grand water feature to replace the plain of mud flats. The project also included the construction of a dam, the ensemble thereby creating a permanent body of water, Capitol Lake. Substantially completed in 1951, this new visual and recreational amenity became an appropriate setting for the Acropolis of the Capitol Group, which now so handsomely supported. So one of Walden White's inspirations was that the Capitol campus, the Capitol group of buildings up on the hill, was like the Acropolis in Athens, and you can see that in their writings that I handed out. Next slide. There's Norman, right in the middle. Ralph Monroe and I this is at the centennial celebration of the Walden White Plan, which occurred August 3rd of 2011. And we're now 5 years beyond that, hard to believe. So, so I was actually both the MC and I also, Les Eldridge was playing Walter Wilder and I was playing Harry White. So we were trying to look sort of Edwardian or something, I don't know. Next slide. So again, the effect that, so half the time, if we did not have the Capitol Lake, we wouldn't have this effect. So go ahead, next slide. And then the Temples of Democracy is another secondary source of history. Professor Henry Russell Hitchcock did back in bicentennial days, did a compilation of all 50 state capitals, and his quote is, "It was at Olympia, Washington that the American Renaissance in State Capitol building reached its climax, such a collection of classical buildings on a plateau surmounting a green hill above sea level provided an irresistible vision. We're the only, you can read it, but we're the only state capitol campus where you can see 2 national parks, Mount Rainier, the Olympics, all mirrored in the blue water below." So the reflection lake is a very important part of the design of our state capitol campus. Next slide. There we go. There it is at night. Go ahead. And there are the mud flats. So do we want to have in the middle of our downtown and our middle of our capitol campus mud flats half the time? I don't, anyway, it's not part of the Walden White and Olmsted plan for our fair state capital city. Next slide. I think this is what the kids want. They want to be able to swim again, and we can do that based on Dr. Milne's analysis. And sure, if we need to bring in a third party to see who's right between ecology and Dr. Milne, let's have at it. That's what the Ruckelshaus Center said to do. Next slide. So actually, that, so the swimming area was open from the 60s through the mid 80s when we were just coming to town. So my kids never got to swim in the lake because it's been shut down. Promenade to connect Capitol Lake and Puget Sound. So this is another, go ahead. So just to show you briefly, in 1990, this is what it looked like with the railroad. Here's the Temple of Justice, Capitol Lake, the railroad tracks, parking lot, warehouses, more with the very small Capitol Lake Park where the swimming area was is here. Elks Building, Capitol Center Building, other buildings, some of which have been taken down. So go ahead. And here we are at 2009, and we've done a very nice job, thanks to the legislature funding it and DES administering it and all that, to create the Arc of Statehood and the beach here, which is unfortunately shut down, and our great North Capitol Campus Heritage Park. We've got the city fountain here, which is a great feature, and on a hot day, it's our most popular place in the city. And and it's all part of the Wild and White scheme for the promenade out to Puget Sound. Next slide. And then the view corridor to the borrowed landscapes of Capitol Lake, Puget Sound and the Olympics. Go ahead. So this is an interesting 1954, the year I was born. This is what it looked like. I wasn't here then, but with all the railroad tracks, and there's the lake, and there is, there's a little bit of Little Hollywood, I guess. It's still left, and all the industrial. You can see that it was kind of air pollution problem that we've taken care of, thank goodness. Next slide. So here it is currently. Unfortunately, we have this building to take care of, but it's there. We have taken care of the thank you Port of Olympia for taking down the big cranes. And anyway, but you can see the idea was, can you imagine Waldron White and the Olmsted standing on the bluff there in 1911, 1912 and looking out at that scene? Wow. Go ahead, next slide. So we're gonna hopefully be able to, with the passage of the Metropolitan Parks District funds, we can take down that building. Next slide. So that's what Waldron White and the Olmsteds were looking at back in 1911. Next slide. So go ahead, next slide. So the Capitol campus, I just want to show, and as you probably all know, it's been phased in over the years. We don't have all the money in the world to have built it overnight. So the Temple of Justice was built in the 19-teens. Next slide. The legislative building and the insurance building were in the 1920s. Go ahead. Then we started building, so this is actually looking back at the insurance building, the Temple of Justice, and the Capitol building. Next slide. And then we started building what is now the Cherbourg building, and then here's where the O'Brien building was under construction. That was in the 430s. Go ahead. And then, of course, World War II happened and things shut down a little bit. So here we now have the O'Brien, the Cherbourg, and the whole Capitol group together. Go ahead. And here we have a look, looking back at it. And, in my mind, I think Waldron White and the Olmsteds, as Professor Henry Russell Hitchcock said, the American Renaissance reached its peak here. And we have the Mona Lisa of Capitol campuses here. And so next slide. So, and it's actually on the National Register of Historic Places back in the Don Barker era when he was our 3rd District representative. I think it dates back to the 79. Go ahead, next slide. And then, so these are just some, I'm an attorney, so I got to leave you with a little bit of law, but 7924-720 says that DES needs to be maintaining our public and historic facilities of the state capitol, which includes Capitol Lake, is in definition to the highest standards of historic properties. And I don't, Chris hasn't gotten any money from the legislature to do it, so, but he needs money in order to do that. So the next, and then final slide is, so, and then under Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act, we need to, we need to recognize that Capitol Lake is a on the National Register and as part of the Capitol campus, and so we're going to have to deal with that issue with Dr. Brooks, Allison Brooks. Next slide, I think, is last, and with questions. So that's it. Thank you for your time. Have fun.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of the, our presentation, a lot of information, wonderful stories there in the last half hour of those folks. We will adjourn until,
Yeah, you too, Bob. Good to see you.